My parents spent $400,000 on my sister's wedding and household goods, and they later sent me the bill by email with a message, "Pay this bill, and if you can't pay it in installments. Thank you for giving us the money." My hands shake by looking at it, but I smiled as soon as I remembered something. The next day was their day of shock. Before I tell you what I remembered that changed everything, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from right now. I want to see how far this story travels. The email notification pinged on my laptop screen at exactly 11:51 p.m. In the silence of my home office, the sound was sharp, like a glass shattering on a tile floor. My apartment was minimalist, clean, and quiet, everything my parents' house wasn't. I stared at the subject line, "Wedding expenses urgent." I didn't open it immediately. I took a sip of my sparkling water, watching the condensation slide down the glass. Panic is a choice, and tonight I chose precision. I clicked open the attachment. It was an itemized invoice totaling $185,342.16. Below the total was a note from my mother, Patricia. It wasn't a request. It was a demand wrapped in emotional blackmail. "Brittany, we trust you to handle this balance. Consider it your contribution to the family legacy. We've already told the vendors you're covering the rest." My first instinct was to scream. I wanted to call them, to yell that I had never agreed to this, that I had warned them a French chateau wedding was insane for a family whose liquid assets were mostly imaginary. I wanted to type out a furious reply detailing every financial sacrifice I had already made for them. But I stopped. I realized that my anger was exactly what they wanted. They fed on reaction. If I argued, I was engaging. If I screamed, I was negotiating. In my line of work as a landscape architect, we learn that you don't fight a landslide by standing in front of it. You divert the flow. This was the Trojan horse silence. I didn't type a single word. I didn't pick up the phone. I let the silence stretch out, heavy and uncomfortable. To them, my silence would look like compliance or maybe fear. They would think I was scrambling to move funds, intimidated by their audacity. They would think they had won. Let them. I minimized the email window and opened a secure, encrypted folder on my hard drive labeled Grandma Eleanor Estate Trust. My grandmother had passed away 5 years ago, leaving me as the sole trustee, a fact my parents conveniently ignored because it didn't fit their narrative of me being the spare child. I scrolled through the PDF documents until I found the original deed of trust. I wasn't looking for money. I was looking for a clause, specifically Article 4, Section C. My eyes scanned the legal jargon until they landed on the paragraph I remembered from years ago, the solvency clause. It was right there, in black and white, signed in Grandma's shaky but determined handwriting. A cold, calm smile touched my lips. The shaking in my hands stopped completely. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. It was a breach of contract. I closed my laptop. I wouldn't reply tonight. I wouldn't reply tomorrow. I would let them sit in the silence for 48 hours. I would let them believe their trap had worked, unaware that they had just handed me the key to their own destruction. To outsiders, the dynamic in the Evans household looked like simple favoritism. They saw Tiffany, the golden child, getting the new cars and the praise, while I, the quiet one, faded into the background. But favoritism implies love, a preference for one child over the other. That wasn't it. My parents didn't love Tiffany more than me. In fact, they didn't really love either of us in the traditional sense. They consumed us. I call it the narcissistic supply chain. In any manufacturing process, you have distinct components that serve different functions. In our family, Tiffany was the show pony. Her job was to provide social capital. She was beautiful, loud, and trend-obsessed. She was the one my mother paraded at country clubs to prove that the Evans genes were superior. Her value was aesthetic. My job was different. I was the workhorse. My function was to provide financial stability and logistical support to keep the show on the road. I was the resource they mined when the facade got too expensive to maintain. This wasn't a new development. It was the business model 2 years ago. My father, Robert, made a series of disastrous real estate speculations. He was illiquid. He claimed a fancy word for broke. He came to my office, hat in hand, asking for a bridge loan. He needed $50,000 to cover a tax lien on the estate. It's just for 90 days, Brittany, he had promised, his eyes wet with performed sincerity. As soon as the market corrects, you'll get it back with interest. I wrote the check. Not out of love, but out of a misplaced sense of duty. I drained my savings account money I had set aside for a down payment on my own home to save theirs. 90 days passed, then a year, then 2. Every time I brought it up, I was gaslighted. Why are you so obsessed with money, Brittany? We're family. You'll get it when we get it. Yet, when Tiffany announced her engagement to a man whose primary qualification was his last name, the illiquidity vanished. Suddenly, there was money for everything. The wedding budget started at $200,000. Then it ballooned to $3 million. By the time they booked the French chateau and flew in a Michelin star pastry chef, the total cost was pushing $400,000. I watched the preparations from the sidelines. I stood there in a $30 blazer I'd bought from a thrift store because I was still rebuilding my savings after the loan, and watched my mother sign contracts for imported orchids that cost more than my car. When I tried to intervene, to point out the math didn't work, Tiffany laughed. Stop being such a buzzkill, Britt. You're just jealous because it's not your day. My mother added, we want this to be perfect. We don't want to look cheap. That was the key word, cheap. To them, spending money was a performance of wealth. Paying bills was an invisible, shameful necessity. So they spent the $400,000 on the performance. And when the curtain fell and the real bills came due, they turned to the invisible necessity, May. They didn't see sending me an invoice for $185,000 as a betrayal. To them, it was just standard operating procedure. The show pony had finished her lap. Now it was time for the workhorse to clean up the mess. But they had made a critical error in their accounting. They assumed my role was fixed. They assumed I was a liability they could overdraw forever. They forgot that even the most reliable machine has an off switch. And I had just found mine. Silence is a vacuum. And if there is one thing a narcissistic family system cannot tolerate, it is a vacuum. They have to fill it with noise, with drama, and eventually with rage. I had calculated a 48-hour window before they escalated. I was wrong. It took them less than 36. The first wave came from the flying monkeys, the enablers who do the narcissist's dirty work. In my family, that role was occupied by Aunt Brenda. Brenda lived for 2 things: boxed wine and Facebook drama. On Sunday morning, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was a screenshot sent by a concerned cousin. Aunt Brenda had posted a status update, tagging me, my mother, and Tiffany. It read, "It breaks my heart to see how ungrateful some children can be today. My sister Patricia just threw the most beautiful wedding for her daughter, sacrificing everything, and yet some family members can't even be bothered to say thank you. Money changes people, but it shouldn't erase where you came from. Sad." Below the post, the comments were already piling up. Distant relatives and church friends were chiming in with prayer hands, emojis, and comments like, "Stay strong, Patricia," and "shameful behavior." I scrolled through them with a detached curiosity. Years ago, this would have crushed me. I would have commented, defended myself, and tried to explain that I hadn't changed. I was just broke from funding their lifestyle. But today, I felt nothing. It was just noise. Digital graffiti on a crumbling wall. I didn't engage. I put my phone down and went for a run. But when Monday morning arrived, the battlefield shifted. They realized that social shame wasn't working, so they aimed for a target that actually mattered to me. My career. At 10 a.m., my boss, Marcus, called me into his office. Marcus was a senior partner at the firm, a man who spoke in blueprints and city codes. He looked uncomfortable. "Brittany, close the door," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. "I received a very strange email this morning. I thought you should see it." He turned his monitor toward me. My stomach dropped not from fear, but but from a sudden, icy clarity. It was an email from my father, Robert Evans. The subject line was, "Outstanding vendor payments, Brittany Evans guarantee." Attached to the email were the invoices for the florist, the caterer, and the venue rental, totaling nearly $200,000. The body of the email read, "Dear Sir, we are contacting you because our daughter Brittany is an employee at your firm. She agreed to manage the accounts for her sister's wedding but has been unreachable for 3 days. We are concerned she is overwhelmed. As these vendors are threatening legal action that could reflect poorly on your firm, please ensure she handles these obligations immediately." I stared at the screen. The audacity was breathtaking. They were trying to garnish my reputation because they couldn't garnish my wages. They were willing to imply I was professionally incompetent and financially unstable just to force me to open my checkbook. They had crossed the invisible line. Family drama is one thing. Professional sabotage is an act of war. "Marcus," I said, my voice steady, "I want to be very clear. I never signed these contracts. I never guaranteed these payments. This is a personal attempt at extortion by relatives who are currently insolvent." Marcus looked at me, then back at the screen. "I assumed as much. You're the most organized project manager I have. But Brittany, if they are emailing me, who else are they emailing?" "Everyone," I replied. "They're scorching the earth." I stood up. The calm I had felt over the weekend hardened into something colder, sharper. "I will handle this, Marcus. Today." I walked out of his office. I didn't go back to my desk to cry. I went to the conference room and dialed the number for the wedding venue. My parents wanted to involve my professional life? Fine. I would involve theirs. They had brought the war to my office. Now, I was going to bring the law to their front door. I spent the next 2 hours doing something my parents had clearly never done, conducting business with integrity. I didn't hide from the vendors. I didn't dodge their calls. I picked up the phone and dialed the number for the floral design firm first. The owner, a woman I had worked with on 3 corporate galas, answered on the second ring. Her tone was frosty. "Brittany," she said, cutting off my greeting, "I didn't expect to hear from you. We were about to file a lien." "I understand, Sarah," I replied, keeping my voice level. "And you should file that lien, but not against me." I explained clearly and concisely that I was not a signatory on the contract, that I had not guaranteed the funds, and that the email from my father was a fabrication. "Send the invoices to Robert and Patricia Evans," I told her. "And if they refuse to pay, proceed with collections. You have my full professional support." I repeated this conversation with the caterer and the venue manager. I didn't protect my parents. I didn't offer to smooth things over. I simply redirected the consequences to the people who had earned them. By noon, the professional fires were out. My reputation was bruised, perhaps, but intact. The vendors knew me. They knew I paid my bills. My parents were the strangers, writing checks. Their ego couldn't cash. Now, it was time for the offensive. I returned to the encrypted folder on my laptop, Grandma Eleanor, Estate Trust. Most people assume a trust is just a bucket of money. But Grandma Eleanor was a shrewd woman. She didn't just leave a fortune. She left a rule book. She knew my father was bad with money. She had watched him fumble his own inheritance in the 90s. So, she had wrapped the family estate in layers of legal protection. I opened the document titled Deed of Occupancy. My parents didn't own the mansion they lived in. The trust owned it. They were merely beneficiary tenants, and their tenancy came with strict conditions designed to protect the asset for future generations. I scrolled to Article 9, the solvency clause. The beneficiary tenant must maintain financial solvency. Any act of bankruptcy, accumulation of excessive unsecured debt, or failure to meet financial obligations that risks liens against the property or damages the reputation of the estate shall constitute a breach of tenancy. In such an event, the trustee is obligated to terminate residency immediately to protect the asset. I sat back, the legal text glowing on my screen. My parents hadn't just overspent. By racking up $400,000 in debt and having vendors threaten legal action, and by documenting their inability to pay in an email to my boss, they had provided irrefutable proof of their insolvency. They had handed me the smoking gun. I wasn't just a disgruntled daughter anymore. I was the trustee. And legally, I didn't just have the right to evict them. I had a fiduciary duty to do it. I opened a new document template on my computer. I didn't type a letter. I typed a notice to quit. The cursor blinked, waiting for my command. For a second, a ghost of guilt flickered in my chest, the old programming that said I existed to save them. But then I remembered the email to my boss. I remembered the thrift store blazer. I remembered the supply chain. I started typing. The keys clacked in a steady, rhythmic cadence. It sounded like a gavel coming down. They didn't knock. They pounded. It wasn't a request for entry. It was a demand for submission. I opened the door to my apartment, and my family spilled into the living room like a chemical spill, toxic and volatile. My mother, Patricia, led the charge. Her face flushed a blotchy red that matched her designer scarf. Robert followed, looking more exhausted than angry. And Tiffany brought up the rear, clutching her phone as if live streaming her own misery. "How dare you?" Patricia screamed, the vibration of her voice bouncing off my bare walls. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The caterer called your father. They threatened to send a process server to the club." Tiffany chimed in, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured cheeks. "You ruined it. You're ruining my first week of marriage because you're too selfish to just pay the bill." I didn't yell back. I didn't defend myself against the accusations of selfishness or the attacks on my character. I simply walked over to my dining table, where 2 stacks of paper were waiting, perfectly aligned. "Sit down," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it had the density of lead. It stopped them. For the first time in their lives, they didn't hear a daughter. They heard an authority. Confused by the shift in gravity, they sat. I remained standing. "You came here to talk about debts," I said, sliding the first document across the polished wood. "So let's talk about them." It was a spreadsheet. I call it the irrefutable ledger. It detailed every single transaction between me and them for the last 5 years. The $50,000 bridge loan from 2 years ago. The tuition payments for Tiffany's dropped classes. The emergency cash transfers. With compounded interest, the total you owe me is $62,400, I stated calmly. "I'm willing to forgive that debt today." Robert scoffed, finding his voice. "We don't have time for your little spreadsheets, Brittany. We need the $185,000 for the wedding, now." "I know you do," I replied, "because you're insolvent." I slid the second document across the table. It was the notice to quit. "What is this?" Patricia asked, her hand trembling as she reached for the heavy, cream-colored paper. "Grandma Eleanor didn't leave you that house, Mother," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "She left it to the trust. She left you a lease, and like any lease, it has conditions." I watched as Robert's eyes scanned the bold text at the top. "Notice of lease termination due to breach of fiduciary duty." Article 9, the solvency clause, I recited from memory. "Tenants must maintain good financial standing by incurring $400,000 in unsecured debt and having vendors threaten legal action against the estate. You have violated the terms of the trust." The room went silent. It was a terrifying, absolute silence. The kind that happens when a bomb goes off, and for a split second, the air is sucked out of the world before the shockwave hits. You can't," Tiffany whispered, her voice small. "I can," I corrected her. "And as the trustee, I am legally required to. I am evicting you." Patricia stood up, her mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. "But we have nowhere to go." "I know," I said, looking her dead in the eye. "But you have 30 days to figure it out. I suggest you start packing." The power dynamic in the room didn't just shift, it evaporated. They weren't parents scolding a child anymore. They were trespassers facing a landlord. And for the first time, they looked at me and saw the one thing they had never expected to see: the person who held the deed. The 30 days passed in a blur of cardboard boxes, slammed doors, and muttered curses. They took everything they could carry, the silverware, the art, even the expensive espresso machine I had bought them for Christmas 3 years ago. I didn't stop them. I stood on the porch, leaning against the heavy oak frame of the front door, and watched the moving truck rumble down the long driveway. When the taillights finally disappeared around the bend, the silence didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like oxygen. I walked back inside. The house echoed, stripped of their clutter and their chaos. For years, this place had felt like a stage set where I was a prop master, constantly fixing things behind the scenes so they could perform their roles as the wealthy Evans family. Now, it was just a house. I walked to the library and looked up at the portrait of Grandma Eleanor above the mantel. For the first time in a decade, the room felt like hers again. "I got it back, Grandma," I whispered. The aftermath was predictable. My parents moved into a 2-bedroom rental on the other side of town, a stark downgrade from the estate, but one they could actually afford. Without the prestigious address, their social circle evaporated almost overnight. It turns out their friends were just like them. They only liked you for what you could offer. Tiffany's fairy tale marriage is already showing cracks. Her husband, realizing the Evans family fortune was a mirage, has suddenly become very interested in budgeting. I heard through the grapevine that the honeymoon phase ended the moment the credit card bills started arriving. As for me, I didn't move into the master suite. I stayed in the guest cottage for a while, taking my time to clean the main house, room by room. It was a ritual, scrubbing away the entitlement, the narcissism, and the ghosts of my role as the spare child. I hired a local crew to restore the gardens, Grandma's pride and joy, which my parents had let wither while they spent money on parties. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, I think about the invoice they sent me. $185,000. It was a staggering amount of money, but in a strange way, it was the best invoice I ever received. It was the price of clarity. It was the catalyst that forced me to stop enabling them and start protecting myself. I opened my laptop one last time and pulled up the irrefutable ledger. I stared at the columns of numbers, the years of financial abuse documented in black and white. Then I right-clicked on the file. Delete. I didn't need the proof anymore. I didn't need the leverage. The debt was settled, not with money, but with boundaries. I closed the laptop and looked out the window at the garden, where the first new blooms of the season were just starting to break through the soil. I had lost a family, yes, but I had regained my life. And looking at the balance sheet of my peace of mind, the return on investment was infinite. Brittany turned an invoice into an eviction notice. If you were in her shoes, would you have kicked them out or given them one last chance? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of justice, please hit that like button.